You are listening to 95.7 FM WELT, Fort Wayne, Radioactive. The opinions and views expressed in the show are those of the hosts and guests only. They do not represent those of FreeThought Fort Wayne, WELT, or any other organization. Welcome to the Hoosier Humanist Hour, where we explore science, religion, culture, ethics, and community from the humanist perspective. Join us as we discuss those topics and more, free from the ideologies of religion and superstition.
Well, good evening, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Hoosier Humanist Hour. The Hoosier Humanist Hour is brought to you by volunteers for FreeThought Fort Wayne Incorporated in affiliation with the American Humanist Association. We got a full house today. We're joined today by V, by Chris, and Josh. We also have Andrew as our tech advisor. You might chime in if we're really, really lucky. And my name is Caleb. Today's topic is ghosts. It's kind of cheesy, seeing as this episode should air right around Halloween, but why not? Let's do it. I love ghosts. I got into my deconversion process because of ghosts, so I've got a lot to say on the topic. But I kind of want to start by just kind of briefly, does anyone have any general experiences in their own lives where they at the time thought they might have actually been experiencing paranormal activity of any kind? Anyone here?
No,
I have never experienced anything.
Really? That's actually kind of interesting. Maybe it's because I'm hanging out with a bunch of humanists now, but when I was... wow, that's actually kind of surprising, because almost everyone that I know outside of this group has had some sort of spiritual experience that they would ascribe to what I would say at the time was the paranormal, that being ghosts, demons, and angels. I kind of consider that realm, and so would most, under the tent of the topic of today. I thought it'd be a pretty good idea to introduce at least one author on the subject who's at least tried to do some research into this. I used to do quite a bit of research into the paranormal, and one author that I really enjoyed. It's just fun to read. Don't get me wrong. I don't endorse any of this man's truth claims, but it's just fun to read, and it's interesting to think about. But his name is Paul Ronald, and there's two books that I'd like to mention today. One is just called Hauntings, and the other is called Ghosts. And the latter here, Ghosts, is a pretty decent run through that kind of explains the culture and the traditions and sort of how this spiritualism movement evolved from the mid-1800s to where it is today. For example, I'm sure most of us remember seeing some of those ghost shows on TV where people would go ghost hunting, and it's almost always in night vision. I'm sure somebody I can't remember some of their names. Ghost Hunters International, Ghost Adventures. Anybody seen any of these?
Yeah, I've seen some of them. Just the occasional part of an episode. I mean, I was never into any of it, so I never spend a whole hour watching a full show. I don't know. It was interesting to see what they come up with, but for the most part, after just 10-15 minutes, I could tell that, yeah, this is your standard run-of-the-mill ghost hunting, and they're not going to come up with anything conclusive. It was just pretty obvious.
Yeah, well, and if you ask them in person, especially, I've actually talked to some of these people in person. When you actually ask these people, most of the time they will hint at the fact, at the very least, that they're tampering with some of the footage to make it more entertaining. But they'll never, ever deny outright that all of it's bullcrap. And honestly, I don't think that they think it's all bullcrap. I think that these guys are doing it because they actually believe it's the case. I don't think they're doing this intentionally to fool people, by and large. I can't say that for everybody. But, I did this for years, and I was really into it, and I really thought that I was catching this stuff. So I'm not saying these guys are lying, per se. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, and I wasn't trying to imply any of that. Like, I didn't think that they were, deliberately misleading people. I mean, I'm sure especially the people that do those type of shows, they probably have some substantial belief in that. I mean, at least I would hope that they wouldn't be so. I mean, to try to frighten people in that way. I mean, that's fairly low, right? So I would at least hope that they wouldn't try to do that.
Yeah, at the time I really thought they were being really sincere. Okay, I'm gonna sort of flip flop on this a little bit because I honestly think that if you've been doing this long enough, this same particular type of evidence, unless you can, well, I don't know. Maybe I shouldn't say that because I found my way out because I was noticing that the evidence just wasn't reliable. It wasn't scientific, but these people really believe that it is reliable and scientific. So I'm going to go ahead and stand by what I said. Actually, I think these people, they really think what they're doing is science. It's kind of confusing, really. I mean, when you tell people that you can run these experiments, go to this place, put this device here, and you can talk or try to communicate with it, and sometimes it actually does things, and it seems to do it in patterns on occasion. In fact, it is sometimes the case where it appears to be the case that it'll respond on cue, for example. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, there are devices such as EMF detectors. They're about the size of a Walkman, and these things are designed to detect electromagnetic frequencies in the air. It's not important, but one of the reasons why they use this device is because they think that ghosts somehow emit this sort of frequency that the device can pick up on. But sometimes it does seem to do things, quote, intelligently. So it's a little confusing, and sometimes it is a bit spooky. In fact, I would even go as far as to say uncanny in some instances. But again, if you just evaluate this evidence as a whole, it just doesn't hold up. Period. And end of story. And I'm sure we'll get into that as we continue into the episode if you want. But
Caleb, let me ask you something. Let me ask you something real quick before we continue on. Like, can you define what a ghost is?
Well, that's a good point. I can't, not in positive terms. The only thing that I can think of that I used to use in positive terms was to say that a ghost was like energy, quote unquote, of some kind. But aside from that, the only answers you're going to get are very ambiguous, and they're just not positive terms. Things like incorporeal, they're non-corporeal, they don't actually exist. These sorts of defining terms, so that it exists as this nebulous, undetectable, but yet we can somehow kind of detect it force in the universe.
Okay. So is it like, I know sometimes people, when they talk about ghosts, would refer to that's the spirit of some dead person, or, I've even heard stuff like the imprint that a person leaves on the universe or something like that when they cross over, or who knows,
I'll give you that. In fact, I'll go ahead and do you one better. Paul Rowland, like I said. Now, I refuse to say that this man is any sort of authority, because I don't believe that there are any such things in this realm, but he understands a lot of the culture and all of that. So insofar as the sociology of it, I guess he'd be up there. But he defines it as such. He says, and I quote, which I define exclusively to be the disembodied consciousness, energy of a once living human being. That's how he describes it. And that's about the best description you're going to get from anybody who honestly, truly, wholeheartedly believes in this stuff, that's actually spent quite a bit of time doing research into it. The one thing that they think actually holds this down, that keeps it within the realms of actuality, reality, is this word energy. A lot of people have this this notion. When you ask a lot of people, especially, it's really fun. Let me just say this. It's really fun to talk to people who are, quote, spiritual, that believe in ghosts, that aren't particularly religious, and ask them what their theories are on what ghosts are or how they operate. It's really fun. It's really entertaining stuff. But often what you'll hear is, one of the most common things you'll hear, rather, is, well, energy can't be created or destroyed, so our energy has to go somewhere. Yeah, that's the common notion there that kind of makes people think, aha, okay, I exist on some level as energy, especially in the brain. I mean, when neurons fire, there's some sort of electrical chemical energy going on
Right,
there.
right.
So a lot of people want to say that, okay, so in that case, energy itself, blah, 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 as I mentioned. So one of the things that got me over this was to just realize that it's not wrong that energy has to go somewhere, but it does go somewhere. It gets recycled.
Exactly.
The same as any other thing that decomposes. Because if you're going to say that this energy has to go somewhere, what about deer? Do deer have ghosts? And you can honestly go on, and you can do this reductio ad absurdum all the way down to like an amoeba before people will finally break and be like, okay, fine. Yeah. At some level.
But I've heard that some people believe that there are like ghosts of pets, like dogs and cats and stuff like that. Like they can leave their spirit behind or something like that. I don't know. I don't know how true, how prevalent that belief is.
Sylvia Browne used to spout that nonsense all the time, man. Of course, she was huge for that.
These things are so easy to test, though. That's the hilarious part. All you have to do is kill an organism inside of a vacuum and realize that none of the energy escapes that vacuum. None of it. Not a single bit of energy or mass is lost in that vacuum-sealed container. Huh. And we normally think of ghosts as being able to permeate and travel through any and all types of matter. Well, that's not the case.
That's really interesting. I never ever thought to try something like that. That's really interesting to think about. Man, I've been doing this for a long time. I've never heard anything like that.
Actually, somebody tried to measure the weight of a soul. Like, I don't know, I think it was something like 100 years ago, and I only vaguely remember the story. But supposedly, they would weigh a person just before they died, and they would weigh them just after they died, and there would be a difference of like 20 or 30 grams or something, which is, very, very little. It's probably about the weight of like one of those USB thumb drives. That's like 20, 30 grams. And supposedly that was the weight of a soul. But what they didn't realize was that between the measurements, like they gave the person a bath or something, and they washed off all the dirt and grime, and that was the difference there.
What you're describing is that was a very famous experiment. It was actually done, and it's been replicated a couple of times. But
they were not done in a vacuum, nor were they completely controlled.
Yeah. It wasn't a controlled environment, like all this stuff. And with these kind of small differences, it's real easy to misdo it.
Well, and it was extremely inconsistent anyway, and you're going to find that even if somehow you're missing some ridiculously small amount that you can't quite account for, it's kind of an absurdly small amount. But I mean, granted, how much does a soul weigh? It just, so fine. I guess it wouldn't have to weigh that much, but as you were saying, man, I would love to see someone redo these experiments in a vacuum. That'd be really interesting. Well, you can't, because you'd actually have to kill the person in the vacuum.
And we know that some animals, apparently don't have souls, so we can't do it with an animal.
Well, at the very least, you might be able to get rid of the notion that the animals have souls, at least, because you'd be amazed at how many people still believe that animals have souls, or at least some animals.
Right.
I didn't think it was all that unreasonable when I was a believer. I really didn't. If I had a soul, what made me so special? Why wouldn't a dolphin have a soul or whatever? It made sense to me at the time.
Well, I've heard of, some religious people claim that, animals don't have souls, and that's why it's okay to eat them as food. Yeah, I've heard that argument. That is a legit argument from some religious people.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
hey, Caleb.
Yes, sir.
Let me play a little bit of devil's advocate here, because that's what a great terminology for the show. But my mom, all right, so my stepmom, she's still living at home. My my grandma, my grandpa, and my father have all passed away in the same home. And so kind of going on to this, let's play into this a little bit. My mom, she really believes in spirits and ghosts, whether they be like orbs that she finds in pictures, or most notably recently, she speaks of like she'll be sitting at home, just her and the dogs, and in one corner of the room, for whatever reason, from time to time, she just spots the dog just looking in the top corner of the room, like for no reason. Now, for me personally, I'm not falling into this. It is noticeably like curious that this happens, but most notably, it's that it could be something as like just a shimmering light from like the neighbor's house or something like that. But she is such a big believer of it, and it's just one of those things when you're around it, when you know someone who's really deep into it, how it can become in its own moment its own religion.
Well, yeah. I honestly, I see that's kind of rough, man, because there's a huge spectrum here, and this goes anywhere from the people who think that okay. See, here's the deal. We're kind of operating under the assumption that we all kind of have this general notion of what ghosts are, but there's all kinds of different notions of what ghosts are and how they operate. So, for example, there are theories that explain certain types of perceived phenomenon that are, I can't remember what they're called. I should have looked into this, but it's a type of phenomenon, alleged phenomenon, where people will see an apparition die over and over and over again, say on the same time every year or at the same time every other night or whatever. And there are, different theories that try to explain this type of phenomenon. There are people that think that there are certain ghosts or some ghosts that don't believe that, or excuse me, wow, I'm going to slow down. There are certain people who believe, for example, as well, that there are ghosts who don't know that they're dead. There are some who think that there are ghosts who just stick around out of fear, the great beyond, and the great beyond aspect in and of itself. These examples are just on and on. Like I said, you could talk to a bunch of people who consider themselves spiritual, and you're going to find almost every one of them have their own, if you want to call it religion, I suppose. I don't know. In my mind, okay, I'll just go ahead and accept it. Yeah. So all that was for nothing.
Here's one thing. Here's one thing that we should say. The experiences that people have are probably real in the sense that they think that that's what they saw. I mean, they're convinced, like they actually saw these things. Now, the explanation for what they've seen needs to be looked at skeptically, needs to be investigated, all that kind of stuff. But I don't think we can just easily say, oh, no, you didn't see what you're saying you saw, or you didn't experience this, or you didn't hear this noise, or you didn't hear this song, because sometimes ghosts supposedly would play a song that they like and people can hear it or something like that. So you could very easily think that you're hearing that particular song. Or sometimes it works with smells too. Like people report that they've smelled, in the morning, like they would smell the breakfast that person used to like.
Sure, man.
And that's, you can't deny that. Like they think that they've smelled that. But the explanation for it has to be looked at skeptically, evaluated, and all that.
Yeah, and I'll give you a great example. This happened to me and my wife. I was just sitting in the living room at a old duplex we used to live in, and she was sitting at the computer next to me. I was just watching TV, and I started smelling something I've never smelled before. But it just smelled what I would describe as old woman smell. It just smelled like an old woman. And I was like, "How did you smell that?" She was like, "No, I don't smell anything." And as soon as she leaned in, the smell went away. Like 2 minutes later, the smell came back, and I just sat there real still, and I was like, "Heather, come here very slowly and see if you can smell something. And she leaned in and she was like, oh my goodness, I know exactly what that is. She marched into our bedroom, and she grabbed this bottle of lotion that she had. She says, this is my grandmother's lotion. She kept it for sentimental purposes. And she was like, was this what you smelled too? And I was like, oh my goodness, that is exactly what I smelled. We sat down on the couch. We did a little EVP session, which is where you sit down, you put a digital recorder, and you just try to talk to the air and see if anything responds. So anyway, when this was all said and done, we go through the recording, and sure enough, we end up hearing what I would, at the time, if we'll talk about this later, classify as a Class B EVP. And it said, I love you too, in response to Heather saying, I love you. And then shortly thereafter, Heather had said, I want you to continue watching over me. And then again, we got another Class B, which said, I will. Okay. Now, does that all kind of come into scope? Everyone understand what I said there? Right. Okay. Yeah, so how do we explain what happened there? This is really bizarre. I had to explain away this in my own head. I do not for a moment believe that I was smelling Heather's grandmother. Okay. Yeah. I think that for whatever reason, I smelled something. It might have even been Heather's deodorant. I don't know. But Heather goes into the bedroom and grabs this bottle of lotion, and I smell that. And lo and behold, what do you know? This is the smell that I recognize. This is the smell. Well, there's a certain type of bias that people have that's a very powerful bias, and it can even, I should have looked into it. But essentially what happens, it's a confirmation bias. Okay, you smell it, and then your brain overrides the smell that you had smelled earlier, and then convinces itself that this is the smell that you had smelled earlier. This sort of phenomenon happens all the time. I can't remember what it's called. But it's a really interesting thing, and it can happen all the time. Like people can see, like somebody rob a bank or whatever, and they'll see the actual event, but if they're shown certain things or if they're asked certain types of questions, they can actually convince themselves that they'd seen something else. One great example. Yeah. Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. Cool.
They've done these experiments before where, you would have people, like a group of people, they would all see something, and then, they would talk amongst each other, and they'd be convinced that they saw that. I mean, sometimes it may be even an extra person that was there, and they'd show them footage. This thing was videotaped, and that thing that they thought happened or saw, or that extra person, or the clothes that somebody was wearing, it was not true, and they could have all swore their lives that this thing was one way and it was another. That this group think. It's very easy to influence people. Apparently, if you know what you're doing, it's very easy to influence people. Yeah,
and this is the same phenomenon that really got the whole Elvis sighting trend, kicking off. People thought they were seeing Elvis all the time. It's a similar situation. But anyway, this same idea, these visual hallucinations, they can operate through what is it called? Audio hallucination? I can't remember.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, audio hallucinations. Sure, let's go with that.
Okay. Yeah. So they can also affect you via audio hallucinations, and they can also do it with tastes and smells. This all applies. These are all just senses. This is just what the brain does. It's really amazing. And so that explains this particular part. And you also have to understand that I was a very strong believer in this. And I honestly did very much want this to be Heather's grandmother, not just because it would be awesome, but for her sake. I really wanted this to be the case. So I have a very strong bias here. Okay. And then now we also have to look at the EVP recording. And so how do you explain away the voices that say, I love you too, and I will? Well, first of all, you'll find alleged different classes of voice recordings of these ghost these ghost voices. Usually the one-word responses are ignored, but they're classified as type C, I believe. And then you got the class B, which is usually the 2 to 5 words, but they're gargly most of the time. They can be clear, but they just need to be short. And then you have the class A, which are either ridiculously clear. There's no doubt that this is saying X, Y, Z, or they're very long in duration. So when I had these two class Bs, this phenomenon is explained away easily. It's called pareidolia. Okay, this is people often see humanistic traits in things that don't actually have humanistic traits. One of the most common ones is people will see faces in things.
Oh yeah, that's extremely common.
Yeah. I mean, you could draw with with 3 lines on a piece of paper a face that people will recognize as a face. This is the same phenomena that people were so obsessed with the face on Mars.
Or Jesus' face on toast. Come on.
Yes, great point. Yeah, and again, these sorts of phenomena apply across the sense spectrum here. So the same thing applies with things that you could hear, and you have to understand when you're listening to these, you are intentionally looking for intelligent responses. So you can't actually walk into this on bias if you want to actually analyze this footage. You just can't do it. You have to be a bias member, really, because you're intentionally looking for intelligent responses. So that
one thing that I was going to throw in there for audio, for ways to trick your ears, I was at this, it's like a children's museum in Bristol in England. And they have this machine where you put on some headphones and it plays a sound. And at first it sounds just completely garbled. But they explain to you that this is somebody reading a sentence, but they've removed certain audio cues that people use to distinguish the beginnings and ends of words and sentences and like all these things. So they've removed all these markers, but most of the sound is still there. So then I don't remember if you got to hear the actual sentence or if they wrote it or if you got to see it on the screen. It was one of the two. And then they played it again, and then it's perfectly clear that this is speech, and you can hear it, and you can distinguish it, and all that. But so your ears are just as easy to trick as your eyes, and we've all seen optical illusions all over the place. Go to any science museum, anything like that. There's bound to be some optical illusions and all that, and it's just as easy to trick your ears.
Yeah, and here's the thing, though. I mean, while I was going through this ghost hunting expedition experience, I loved it, and you have to understand, I already knew that this was a problem, that there was a bias. I knew that pareidolia was a thing, but one of the ways that I tried to get around this problem, because I was trying to, quote, scientifically measure this stuff, was I had to just accept the fact that while I'm looking for this information, I'm going to have a biased outlook, but I can show this to neutral members and see if they get a same or similar response. And it was quite often the case that, they would hear the same thing that I heard. But again, this is confirmation bias because most of them were not that way. There's a whole lot of misses before you start getting the hits.
Yeah, and that's the other fallacy that we talked about is counting the hits and dismissing the misses, and then in your own mind you start to create this pattern that's really not there.
Yeah, and plus a lot of these responses are very generalized, and they can be explained away easily, and because most sounds that are generated, and just when you're trying to be really quiet, when you're in a really quiet room, the microphone sensitivity is up, and it picks up on all kinds of things that you wouldn't hear otherwise, which is why people use them in the first place.
Right.
And so little shuffles, that sounds like that could be anything. That could be 2 words. That could be 1 2-syllable word. But those 2 words responses or 3-word responses are incredibly common, and people legitimately count them because they sound as if they're intelligent responding to a thing. But most people ask really dumb binary questions too, like let
me throw in something else in there. So especially with old recorders that are tape recorders, if you are overwriting an old recording, it doesn't go away completely. Like the recording isn't perfect, especially on tape recorders. So even if you take like an old tape and you erase it, and if you replay it, if you crank up the volume enough, you can still hear some of what was already there. Now, that doesn't happen with digital recorders, but with the old tape recorders, oh, yeah. Oh, that was totally a thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you bring that up, because there was also a similar phenomenon that brought about what were known as ghost faces back when photo photography started to come about. People would see what looked like, and they were, I shouldn't say they looked like, they were faces that shouldn't be there. And what was happening was some of the exposure of the prior photo was leaking onto the new photo. So sometimes there'd be this face, or objects even sometimes, where there shouldn't be, and it looked very ghostly and ethereal because it's just an accident. It wasn't supposed to be there. Yeah. And so that created a pretty interesting phenomenon, which is one of the main reasons why back in the mid 1800s they had this huge spiritual boom. There were all sorts of new technologies that people could play with that seemed very supernatural, and people started to develop really interesting techniques to trick people too. So around this era is when paganism really started to pick back up again, and people would claim to be mediums and talk to ghosts and angels and sometimes even demons. As you can imagine, the church frowned on this quite heavily and cracked down on it pretty hard. So it sort of dissipated, and it became extremely taboo. But there was a period, I want to say it was in the early 1900s, very early, like 1910s, when here in the Americas and in Europe, there was this huge re-explosion of it, where you'd see these sort of stare into the crystal ball type folk. Palm readers and people who were, clicking buttons under the table that would make things knock, that typical sort of scene. Mm-hmm. That's really when this boomed, and it got really huge. And over time, people started to debunk these things. Even back then, people started to, fall away from it again. The church was still not happy with this. The church had a heavy presence in the United States still, and in Europe. And eventually it sort of dissipated. It became this sort of spiritualism. I think the hippies had a lot to do with that too. I think that's just a guess. I'm just saying.
Hippies, man.
Yeah, and then we had this really interesting phenomenon where, in the early 90s, late 80s, we started seeing people try to take advantage of this through different mediums, like over the phone, on TV. They would do live audience shows with psychics and mediums. Miss Cleo, I would say, is arguably the most famous one. There was a time when it cost like $8 a minute to talk to this woman.
Oh, wow.
It was incredibly expensive.
How much does that make per hour? That's quite a lot. Times 60? Holy cow.
Yeah, she was making a lot of money. She got extremely popular.
$480 an hour.
She was in high demand, man. And I, in my mind, I think I mentioned her earlier, but I think the second most famous medium or psychic would be Sylvia Browne.
Oh, yeah.
You started seeing this sort of interesting trend came up, and I got sucked into this. Now, mind you, I was really young when this stuff came out, so I had all these people actually telling me this stuff was real. Like my stepmom Peggy. I'm going to edit that out. So one of my parents would suggest that I shouldn't even watch it out of fear for my soul. Literally, I shouldn't be watching it. It's going to corrupt me, on some level. So there was still a very strong Christian hate for this sort of thing back in that time, but somehow it still managed to get out there. I think that was probably good, for honestly. Kind of
well, many pastors and would warn the people in their churches that these especially like with Ouija boards, remember those? They would warn people when those came out that they can lead to demonic possessions.
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you get into that aspect of it, man. So I don't know if I mentioned on this episode, I know I mentioned it before, but I was actually a member of a ghost hunting group. We actually traveled the tri-state area. People would call us. We didn't call out. People called us to have us investigate their house. Sometimes people would claim to have demons in their house. There was one instance where there was this lady who said that her and her aunt was this extremely old bedridden woman, were having very demonic poltergeist activity. When I say very demonic, I'll clarify, because the way she describes it sounds very demonic. She was a very Christian woman. She had a lot of religious imagery in her house, and she claimed that it was often the case that she would find her crosses and crucifixes upside down. She'd find them in the toilet. She'd find her Bibles tossed about, and this, that, and the other. Very typically demonic stuff, right? This is stuff that you'd probably see in like The Exorcist. Like this is the type of stuff that she was describing. And I, at the time, even being a believer, I claimed bull. I was like, no way. This lady's full of crap. I've never seen anything like this. I've never heard of anyone who's seen anything like this, and on any sort of consistent basis. And if they do, they keep it hush hush. But anyway, so we went over there regardless. If you call us, we will come. And we checked the place out. And right when we got there, sure enough, some of the crucifixes were upside down, and somebody did find one of them in the toilet. But let me tell you, man, that was one of the most boring investigations I've ever had in my life. It was this itty-bitty little house in the middle of nowhere, and nothing exciting happened. I mean, we really gave it our all. Some of us really I'll just say it that way. Some of us really believed that there were some demons in this house, or at the very least, some malicious spirits. But no, we didn't.
How long did you spend there? Like, I'm curious now. How long does an investigation like that last? I mean, is it hours?
Well, we would go to their house and attempt to be there by 10. Okay. We would request that they not be in the house, but if they want to, obviously, we can't stop them. But we would, at the very least, continue the investigation until 1 o'clock. Mm-hmm. There were times where we were up until the sun came up. For whatever reason, the once you can start seeing what's around you, ghosts go to sleep or something. I don't know, but once there's light in the room, the show's over and it's time to pack up.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
those ghosts are really scared of the light.
I guess I never did really hear any good reason why that was the case. I never
Maybe
could
just
get
really
a good
tough
response.
to see. Maybe they're just really tough to see in the light. That's what it is.
Maybe. I mean, because you'll hear, especially in hotel hauntings, which are a category in and of themselves, you'll often hear these ones are almost always in the daylight for some reason. They seem to have a different sort of psychology to them for whatever reason. Except
one thing that I want to know is, like, why would ghosts do these things? Like, why would a ghost just go and like knock down your books, or like turn the cross upside down? Like, if I'm a ghost and I can do anything, I can go anywhere, I can go through walls, I can go and do all these things. I mean, I can think of a million better things to do. I mean, really, like, I can go and peek through the Hubble telescope. I can go and learn something new. I can go on a boat and travel around the world, or I can sneak into the some Area 51 and see if there's aliens. Maybe there's aliens. I don't know.
But see,
you know what I mean? Like,
but when you're a ghost, like, you've already done all that stuff, so now you're bored. You got to come back to the house and knock over some books and scare your kids.
Because that's somehow fun. I mean, is it supposed to be fun?
Of course. I mean, after you've gone through the whole world tour thing, you got to come back and mess around with people I kind of wanted to come back for 1 second because we were going on about kind of like the 90s. I don't know if anybody else remembers, like, making phone calls with the old home phone and picking up maybe the neighbor's call, or picking up an errant call that kind of just seemed off.
Oh yeah.
Where you were picking up something else, and it maybe not crystal clear, but you were getting something else and it just seemed real shady. I don't know if it was just me, but that was another one of those moments where you're just kind of like, what's going on here?
Oh, that's really easy to happen. I mean, when you consider, like, especially the older phones, I mean, the cables would go into these giant bundles of cable before they reach the the nearest telephone station. I mean, you would have like thousands and thousands of wires running parallel to each other. I mean, there's interference, there is magnetic effects, there's all kinds of things, and
electromagnetic crosstalk.
Yeah, that's the technical term for it. It's called crosstalk.
Yeah, I had to deal with that a lot with plain old telephone system.
Oh yeah,
the POTS lines.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that and well, the used to have the same thing with the old 900 megahertz wireless cordless phones, and even the 2.4 gigahertz phones would get all kinds of crosstalk. I remember having baby monitors when my boys were little, and picking up conversations from our neighbors.
Oh yeah, I remember doing the same with my walkie-talkies. See, I was that what you were talking about, Josh? Because I've never done
walkie-talkies, phones. Yeah, I've done it with phones, walkie-talkies. Just crossing signals. It's kind of fun. I remember it back then. I mean, you don't do it often. You don't do it now, but it's just one of those things where it was fun, to kind of speculate what was going on that other end. I mean, obviously now we can kind of figure out, we figured it out through telecommunications that we know this is what was happening.
Right.
I kind of want to. Is it all right if I play a little game where I kind of let's explain that kind of thing with ghosts?
Sure. Let's do it.
Okay. What does that entail?
Well, yeah. Let's play along. I know that a friend of mine, she has a picture of, I think it's a digital photo, in like 2005, 2006, of her at her house, and there was a child playing with a ball, and she actually has a picture of it, and you can see an outline of the child. Like you can, if it's not something to like, I can pull it up on Facebook, but she had a picture with the silhouette with you could see the face and everything, and it was superimposed. Like it almost looked like a negative. Like if you were thinking, if it was like a regular photo, it would look like a negative postered on top of the picture.
Yeah, well, what you're going to find, even with digital photography, there's always going to be a chance that there's going to be some sort of optical effect that's going to make things appear unusual or something that they really aren't. I had a lot of issues with a similar. Let me just explain this one real quick. So what you have here is likely an instance of something in the background which was not being focused on by the camera at all, and it might have just briefly gone past the camera during the shutter, or something along those lines. It could be any number of things. But when you combine that with that pareidolia effect, again, people want to associate imagery with human characteristics and human traits. It's just what we're programmed to do. This is a type of heuristic that we're all born with.
Yeah, look at the face on Mars. When you look at it at first, when that picture was taken, I mean, that looks like a face. But then the next time they came by with a much better camera and took a picture of the same thing, I mean, it doesn't look like a face at all. It has nothing to do with a face. It's just a mountain that's eroded a little bit different on one side than the other. And
well, that, and faces in particular, because when you're an infant, really the only clear image you see is your mother's face, and or maybe somebody else's face, because it just happens to be the right distance where they can see clearly. So that's just what they focus on first, and then learn to recognize it and learn about it. And so it's just the first thing that comes to mind when people see something that might look like a face. It's one of the only reasons why we can watch a cartoon. If we couldn't make out the fact that these cartoonish beings have faces, we wouldn't know what the hell is going on.
Yeah, and many cameras have advanced, processing capabilities, and you could accidentally do something to that photo, not even realizing that you were doing it.
Well, it was also a known issue with older, like the earlier digital cameras, and especially earlier camera phones, where they would have sensor burn-in, where it would have
Oh yeah, I remember that.
Partial previous image, or if it was focused on something for long enough, it would just have that like a ghost of that to kind of
burnt right into it, right into the lens.
Yeah, it would be on the sensor, and I had several friends that had cameras like they had to get rid of because they had too much burn in on them.
Yeah, I mean, electronics are not perfect by any means.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. So I think that one's sufficiently explained. I don't know, Caleb. You know, you being the ghost hunter at one point. I don't know if you had heard of the orb phenomenon. Pictures with orbs in them. It could be the exact the exact same explanation, or what's your take on that one?
Well, it quite often depends, because there's different types of phenomenon that are described as the orb phenomenon.
There's different colors. There's there's all kinds of different meanings behind it that they give.
Yeah, for example, there are people who will just catch a photo of one, and it's just a sphere that shouldn't be there for whatever reason. And then you'll also find people who actually capture what they consider to be orbs on camera. And these ones are really interesting because you could obviously see them in live action, but sometimes it looks as if this orb is going in and out of material objects, often like people. And people will sometimes claim that they could feel that when it happens, or this, that, and the other. But so far as explaining it goes, there again, I'll start with the simpler ones. That any photo of an orb, even while I was in my ghost hunting boots, I never really took those seriously. It was impossible to know on a photo, just a raw photo, if it was a bug, a snowflake, a piece of dust, something that's on the camera. It's just impossible to know. Yeah, there are just too many variables. But with the footage ones, those ones get looked into more thoroughly, and there are alleged ways to distinguish between bugs, for example, dust and snowflakes and raindrops and all these sort of things. And so some people will say, okay, well, we have this particular object which doesn't appear to fall under any of those other categories. I'm going to label this an orb. This is really just an argument from ignorance in and of itself. This is to say, I can't explain what this is, so I'm going to associate it with what I think is the best idea. Nobody else can explain it away, so it's most likely to be the case. When really, it's more often than not some sort of lens flare of some kind. It's almost always a lens flare.
One easy way to get orbs in your picture. Take your camera out at night. Put a light behind you, and put your camera in night mode. That way, it takes longer for the camera to take the picture, and just take the picture. You'll have hundreds of dots in your, or little orbs. They're going to be all up in your picture, guaranteed. It's just little particles in the air that reflect, and they're not on focus. So the way the light comes in and hits the camera lens, it looks a lot bigger than it is.
Make sure you're by a campfire. That way you get all those sparks too.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Well, one of the good ones that you're describing are just pieces of plastic, really, like wrappers. People, a good example would be like just like a wrapper from a coffee drink or something.
Okay.
Those things, they reflect light in an unusual way, and it comes up very bright and vivid on pretty much even night vision cameras. It comes up very bright and vivid, and if it's drifting, it'll go in an unusual, unpredictable pattern. And because it's moving around, sometimes the light will get refracted away from the lens, so you won't see it. So it'll appear as if it's going in and out of people. This is another one of the examples. It could be just a small particle, or just any reflective material. It really doesn't matter, but it happens. I actually have footage myself of this exact phenomenon, and we spent 15 minutes, the first 15 minutes, the first time we ever watched this thing, in almost sheer terror. I was scared of what was developing on my camera. I just happened to put my camera on a table and left it recording. I did that intentionally to catch ghosts. And then we went down to the basement to do an investigation. And on camera, you could see this light slowly manifest very close to the camera. And then it looked exactly like a face. It had defining features. It was uncanny. It slowly, over the course of like 10 minutes, morphed into this face, bright and vivid, staring right at the camera. And all of a sudden, you see this thing shift. And it appears as though the face looks very quickly, turns its head really quickly. It's just a face, mind you, towards the back door. And then, poof, it just flashes off the camera. And like 2 seconds after this thing flashes off the camera, we walk upstairs from our investigation. So we were down there for about 15 minutes. And this blew our minds. It appeared as though this ghost face just manifest, heard us coming, saw us, panicked, and ran away. That's what it looked like on camera. It was really, really scary. But when we analyzed the footage and I enhanced it, all I had to do was brighten the footage. That's it. I found out that it was just a wrapper from a coffee drink, and the fan was on, but it was the fan was on a very low setting, so it was just barely moving this thing. So that's what made it slowly morph into this face object. So it was really unusual and bizarre, and I'm telling you, that was one of the few times that actually got me into panic mode when I was doing the investigation, because I'm in this house looking at this footage in the spot where this alleged ghost was, thinking, "Oh man, this is unreal." I was buying into it.
All it takes is a little bit of your natural brain paranoia that we all have, and there's a face. I mean, we evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago to be scared of things, because that's how we survive. You hear something in the grass, you run away. You don't go check up on it. You don't know what it is. Could be something that kills you. You think you see something, you run away. I mean, those are the people that survived, and so we naturally are saddled with this evolutionary baggage almost, to see things where there isn't anything, to hear things when there isn't anything. I mean, I'll give an example. My dad was telling me he was out in nature, hiking, and they had a tent somewhere in the middle of nowhere, and they heard this noise, like somebody was coming, and they turned on a flashlight and there was nobody there, and it was really freaking them out. Finally, they figured out what it was. It was a turtle. But it sounded like a person was walking. The same sound that the grass makes. A little bit of a thud when it steps, probably from the shell, like hitting on something. Who knows what it was, but it was just a silly turtle. Nothing special about it. I don't even think it was that big of a turtle. It was probably some medium or small size ones.
Yeah, footsteps. Those are honestly just as common as voices. People will call us not because they see things or because they heard voices or things are missing. They think they're hearing footsteps. Yeah. Houses sometimes. Let me just say this very loud and clear. Houses just sometimes sound like somebody's walking in them. There's all sorts of rhymes and reasons for it, and they vary. But let me just throw it out there, folk. Houses just make random noises from time to time. It happens. That's all it is.
Oh yeah, I've got one on that one. My mom's had it twice now, where I can explain it away now. But she started off with, I swear I heard footsteps last night, and we let it go. Couple months later, go up in the attic, just a terrible amount of dead mice up in the attic, and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I think I know where those footsteps were coming from back then.
Yeah, and see, if you were up there in the attic, it wouldn't sound anything like somebody walking around. It would sound like a bunch of mice scurrying about. So your house will channel sounds in different ways too. Like you were describing earlier, your mom's experience where the dog was sitting there staring at the wall. There's all sorts of reasons. The number one reason, honestly, there's probably a hum coming from that corner. For whatever reason.
Could be electrical.
I was about to say, it's often electrical. Dogs can hear that. They pick up on it. One way you can test for it is to take one of those handy dandy EVP meters and put it right next to it, and if it just goes wild, it's just an electrical hum. That's all it is.
It's an old house. I mean, there's right in that particular spot, there used to be a light, and there isn't anymore. There's probably just a dead wire, maybe probably a live wire that we probably should get checked. But yeah,
you should probably check that.
Another footsteps that she heard, I think this was just last year. She thought, something was thumping in the night, and she started to freak out. And it was like in the wintertime. Come to find out, we live in a very wooded area. It was just snow melting off trees and hitting the roof of the house. But she, at that moment, you're in the house and you hear this, and you just kind of let your mind take it to wherever you want to. And this scenario was for her, kind of to be like, this is somebody, saying, hey, I'm watching over you, answering questions,
I think I just had an interesting thought. Maybe it's not. We'll see. But I think part of the problem is the fact that, Avi was describing, sort of the genesis and the makings of these heuristics on a genetic level. And I think part of the problem is the fact that we are sequestered. We're stuck in one spot here. And when something's creeping us out, we can't just leave. We can't just run to the next tree and move on. So because we have these tendencies to anthropomorphize things and etc., I think this is what really, it really adds fuel to the fire. There we go.
Oh yeah, and keep in mind that ghost stories have been around since the beginning of basically human culture as we know it. One of the oldest books that we're aware of is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and even that book has ghost stories in it. Now, I haven't read the book, but that's what I came across as I was doing my research for the episode. So, these things have been with us as people, in our culture, basically since we have a written history. People have had ghost stories, and they would hear and see things and explain it in different ways. And one thing that happens is these stories change with time. What ghosts did, 100 years ago is different from what ghosts do today, and it's different from what ghosts did, 1,000 years ago. So
yeah. Well, they shift, in my opinion. From what I've seen, it seems to be the case that our opinions on the supernatural just shift based on what we don't know and what we fear most. People used to worship bears, and for good reason, because there was no reason why anybody should ever go up and pet a bear. So they revered them and had a healthy respect for them, and that was one way to kind of breed into the culture. Hey, have a healthy respect for bears. Leave them alone. By and large, you see one, it's probably not going to maul you, but just be calm, be cool, worship it a little, thank it for not eating you, and move on. But, these sort of things. And, people who used to worship trees, they didn't know into the sun and all this jazz. And, ghosts and goblins and gooks, these things just kind of pop up when we're just nervous, when we don't know what that was, that false positive. It's got to be something. Or it could just be the wind.
That is all the time we have for you this week. This has been the Hoosier Humanist Hour. Be sure to check out FreeThought Fort Wayne on Facebook and on Meetup.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope your days are filled with logic, reasoning, and the eternal quest for knowledge.
Leave them alone.